All right,
So
do you guys want to do
before
intro?
we begin, I'm going to quickly ask that all of the judges, if they're here, hey, Naya, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay. Um, we'll just begin with introductions and as procedure, quickly note your POI preferences, your team, your side, speaking order, and if you're comfortable, your pronouns.
I'm Xander Deutsch. I'm gonna be the prime minister of the government team. He him pronouns.
What school?
Sorry, this is Menlo Horace Mann.
And I'm Emily. I will be the member of government. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, also from Horace Mann Menlo.
I'm Sophie Yurkin, POI's verbally pronouns, she, her, hers. I'll be the first speaker, and from Stuyvesant, Horace Mann.
And by process of elimination, I'm member of opposition. I'm Everett. I'm from Stuyvesant, Horace Mann, and I go by any pronouns. And POI's out loud and all that stuff.
Okay, are all judges good? Ready to go. Perfect. Okay, 7 minutes each. If anybody's not ready, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Let's get right into some definitions and background. This house is going to be a rational individual. Reparations for this debate round is going to be the act of giving compensation in the form of money for some past wrongdoing. And wrongdoing in this situation is in order to make amends and redress injustices. All descendants of enslaved people in the topic is obviously going to be somewhat difficult to find all descendants of enslaved people. But assuming it is possible to do so, we'd find as many as possible, giving some sum of money to their families. The win mechanism for this debate round is going to be net benefits with a focus on these descendants of enslaved people first and foremost, then on general society. The observation before I get into cases as follows. Supports is a key word within the motion. This is because it's not a this house would motion, it's a this house supports motion, meaning that the majority of this debate should be about the concept/theory of these reparations and not about the step-by-step implementation or feasibility of the reparations. That is a key distinction as we move forward in the debate. So, implicit in this motion, we are not arguing feasibility. We are essentially assuming that we can feasibly come up with this system that gives reparations to all descendants of enslaved people. However, if you buy that we are arguing feasibility, we can still assume that these reparations would not be difficult to implement for 2 reasons. One, with all the new technology that exists, the government would still work with experts to implement in a structured way to find all these people. And 2, looking back at past precedent, reparations have been successfully implemented in the past among Native Americans and Japanese citizens. That being said, let's get into the advantage number 1, which is the good for descendants of enslaved people. The uniqueness for this is as follows. After 400 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, and ongoing police brutality, we see that the situation for descendants of enslaved peoples in America today is not preferable. Additionally, look to the fact that post-slavery, there was enslaved people that were closed off from education and voting in public facilities as a result of the color of their skin. What do we see as a result of this? Well, we just see widespread disadvantages throughout society and the ability to function within like life and within America. This means that promised freedoms in war were violated constantly. Look to even as far back as the Revolutionary War, where African Americans worked with either side for the guarantee of freedom, only to get that violated post-Revolutionary War. Additionally, look to redlining. Historically, redlining has existed in a huge extent towards Black Americans. Services/investments into neighborhoods has been withheld because of classification of these neighborhoods as hazardous due to the people living in the region who tend to be African American. Now, the big question here is, how do reparations uniquely solve for all of the harms that I just listed? There are 3 main answers. 1, reparations solve because families have been boxed into impoverished communities due to the redlining that I've aforementioned, and gerrymandering and a lack of public funding. This money helps them get out of these situations and or get into better socioeconomic circumstances. The second point is that it helps restore communities. Historically, Black communities have been faced with the worst forms of pollution when it comes to government because of the fact that they tend to lack trees structures and there's general waste facilities that are close to these African American communities. Why is this important? Well, again, we see that because there is no socioeconomic representation among these Black communities, they are put in bad communities with bad government action towards them. An increase in like money as a result of giving them reparations allows them to not only restore the communities but also have more give when it comes to how government officials use their resources and make it so that it's not as disadvantageous to Black communities. The third and final point here is cultural restoration. We see that an increase of money towards these African Americans and formerly enslaved descendants is going to be beneficial because it allows for a restoration of culture that has been destroyed due to tampering and due to the dominance of the white race throughout the
Here,
past,
see, pause time.
past decades.
Pause
Yeah.
time. Like, what amount of money are we talking for reparations?
Sure. We would say so again, we would say look to past models here. I mean, I would if like an exact number is not something I can give you without like research.
No,
because,
that's fine, but like ish.
like we're talking like high ends, like thousands of dollars.
Okay.
Like in the upper tens thousands of dollars, if that makes sense. Like obviously I don't have the exact figures on me because we don't have research, but okay. Time continues in 3, 2, 1. So in terms of cultural restoration, we actually see that there's going to be an increased amount of Black culture as a result of giving reparations to descendants of enslaved people. That being said, let's get into the advantage number 2, which is the good for general society. The claim here is quite simple. We think that the system of reparations would be good for society at large. The warrants for this are as follows. 1, it closes the racial pay gap. This is one of the most important government points in the debate round for the following reasons. What we see is that in the status quo, families that are of white families have hundreds of thousands of dollars higher in net worth as opposed to that of Black families. Why is this problematic? Well, this means that when we have a worsening middle class divide between that of the upper echelons of society and the middle class, Black people are actually falling behind at higher rates, and those who are enslaved people are falling at even higher rates. This is problematic because it means that formerly enslaved descendants are now at disadvantages among society due to the fact that there is a racial pay gap that exists in the status quo. It is good to have a larger middle class because society benefits both socially and economically. People work with each other more. It promotes consumer spending. People have higher levels of trust in government. We think that when you implement reparations and these Black Americans are able to achieve upward mobility, the racial pay gap that closes is good for society at large. The second point here is moral society. We think that if these reparations are implemented, the majority of people in the US will agree that moral justifications for them, and we think that it is good to move towards a society that is doing the moral thing. People feel better about themselves. They feel like they are on the side of justice. Now, side opposition might come up and claim that the government might give them reparations and then automatically feel that they've done all they need to do. We argue this is actually not the right framing for the debate round because of the fact that currently the government thinks that they've done enough and they don't give reparations. So in that like the argument of guilt is probably not going to be a big factor in this round. The third war under this is promotes public discourse. We open discussion further about the injustices that Black Americans face during the post-Civil War. This is always a good thing. There's always room for improvement and more discussion among society. The fourth point is that it admits wrongdoing. A prerequisite to really truly helping to fix past mistakes is admitting the problem. Giving reparations to descendants of enslaved people tells the government, like admits that the government has done wrongdoing and needs to pay back. The sixth point out of this is that precedent exists, looks to Japanese and Native Americans. Additionally, the seventh point is that corporations and the governments have benefited from slavery. Look to corporations and the government actually profiting off of the trade that slavery created, whether that was through cotton or other means. So we see that the economic output of slavery is being returned to the people who helped to make that happen through reparations, at least in some small amount, which is important because it shows that there is some sort of closure here, and it shows that there is moral wrongdoing that has been committed and something that is being restored. For these reasons, I urge a strong vote for side government. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Fantastic speech. All right. Is everyone ready? Okay. I'll begin my time starting Now, side government's case basically says that formerly enslaved people have been disadvantaged. We agree. However, side government's case doesn't solve. For all the reasons they tell you that Black people have been marginalized, those are the exact same reasons why reparations will never work. And for that reason, we are more than proud to oppose. A few things I want to do in this speech. First, I want to go through some top of case things. Then I want to go into one observation on side opposition's case. Then our two contentions for you. Finally, I want to respond to side government's case. Let's start on top of case. First, on their feasibility thing, we agree with them. It's not a policy motion, but we do think talking about the logistics and the actual impacts of the fact that's going to be logistically tough do matter. The other thing we want to talk about is the differences between natives and like Japanese enslaved reparations in comparison to enslavement reparations. We think that it's probably harder to locate the files and records of slaves because a lot of those have been burned, destroyed throughout history. I think it's probably harder to figure out more on that in just a second. Before I do that, I want to make an observation at the top of side opposition's case. We think that generally, when you think of what the point of reparations are, it's to make a change and minimize inequity to the specific group. That being kept in mind, that's what we want reparations to do. If they don't do that, then reparations don't work at their job, and we should probably do something else. That being said, let's get into our two contentions for you on side opposition. And if I have time, I have like a little bit of a principle thing. Our first contention is on benefits to descendants of enslaved people. Three main reasons that side opposition benefits enslaved people. First, we think there are smarter things to do than impose reparations. We think that generally there are ways to help people beyond just reparations. There are three main reasons why reparations don't work, or even if they do work, don't work perfectly or effectively. The first reason reparations don't work is people who get reparations don't necessarily spend it on all of the things Xander tells you about. They don't necessarily move. They don't necessarily do that. Importantly, if it's $1,000, $10,000, that's not enough money for you to do all of these things. We don't have a guarantee it's going to be spent on something good. The second reason reparations don't really work is because it is not necessarily true that just because you are a descendant of a slave, you need resources the most. There could be other people who need it just as much in society, and those people probably need money to the same extent. The third and final reason that reparations probably don't work is because it's a logistical nightmare. It is almost impossible to make sure all descendants of slaves are getting reparations. Records are burned, and it is literally just so hard. If you're working all day, you probably don't even have time to go into the office and make sure your reparations are getting taken care of. Importantly, we think the people whose files have been burned and the people who aren't marked as slaves probably need the reparations just as much. We think it is far better for the US government to work to reduce inequity across the board, with the goal of reducing inequity not just being reparational. If you try to think in the past, the policy is probably not going to be as good or not going to be as effective. If you institute better systems, allow affirmative action in college to increase diversity, or allow more access to schools in certain areas, make sure to decrease redlining, all those policies probably work better than reparations and make sure that they're actually affecting things from the root up and not just thinking in the past or things that actually don't apply. The second reason that we think we benefit descendants of enslaved people in our world is because of this anti-motivation mindset that comes across in America. We think if you instate reparations, that creates a societal attitude that, oh, we've done enough, we no longer have to do anything else. Importantly, people probably think, we just gave so much money to a huge population of our community. We don't need to have protests anymore. Everything's solved. Great. We think that's really, really bad because as we've already told you, reparations don't address the root problem. They give you money, but they don't fix the systems of inequity. They don't fix the redlining. They don't fix the lack of education or the lack of access to educational institutions. We think all those things are incredibly problematic and don't get solved just by giving lump sums of money. Importantly, though, now you don't have any buy-in or people trying to solve those things, especially since this was such a big policy that was passed. The third reason that we benefit the descendants of enslaved people is on racism. We think that generally, when you institute this policy, it probably just leads to a massive amount of increased racism in two main ways. The first way that racism increased is it implicitly assumes descendants of slaves need help from white people or from a government and that they need to be given this money. There's an implicit assumption in that if you were the descendant of an enslaved person, you're going to be disadvantaged. You're not going to be on the same level. Sure, there's like truth to the fact that there are systems of inequity in America, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person who was enslaved can never be successful and needs the help of a white person with actual money to get back from that. They are able to do things on their own, and we think that assumption allows for problematic thought to be portrayed. But the second reason racism exists, and more importantly, is people, white people, everyone in society is probably mad that their money just went to reparations. We'll talk about more about why that is. But if people are mad that their money just went to reparations, they're more mad and angry at the white people on the street. They want their welfare. They want their money. They want access to whatever they want. And now they feel like they're not getting it. Their taxpayer monies are going away. That means you see more hate crimes on the street, worsen quality of life for people of color in America. And we think all of that is just generally problematic for the quality of life of enslaved people. That being formerly enslaved, descendants of formerly enslaved people. That being said, I want to go into our second contention on benefits to general society, which also have impacts to the formerly enslaved descendants. 3 reasons why we benefit society on our side. First is backlash. We think the backlash here that comes from passing this or from giving reparations is going to be ridiculous. People are probably furious about the fact that all of their money is going to reparations. 3 core reasons why people are going to be specifically mad about this policy in comparison to any other policy that would be passed. The first reason our people are mad is because they probably want other things to be spent on. Republicans in Congress right now are super mad that we're spending money on anything. Maybe they want money for the military, but they're mad that it's being spent on something that's not going to affect them, especially when it's their money. The second reason they're specifically mad about reparations is because people are probably racist. I mean, not everyone, but there's a lot of America that is. They're probably mad that all of their taxpayer dollars are going to that. And third and finally, and the most important reason that people are specifically mad about reparations is because of the disconnect. I think a lot of people in America struggle to see how by giving money to descendants of people who were formerly enslaved, you're actually going to help them. They can't see that connection. And at the point where they can't see that connection, they're especially mad and feel like they're giving money to a past problem rather than helping the future. We think this causes protests in their streets. The Republicans go crazy. They probably want to reduce spending. Maybe welfare projects get cut in order to even pass this in the first place. They don't want this bill to go through Congress. So if they're going to allow it to happen, other things are going to have to be cut. Inflation maybe goes up. Just general problems happen in society. Gridlock happens in Congress. Protests happen. There's civil unrest. The second reason we help general society is because of other groups. We think that it is really, really hard to draw the line as to who gets reparations and who doesn't. Where do we draw this line? Do we give it to every single Native American person whose land is being taken away? Do we give all of the land back? Do we give it to every person with Japanese internment camps? We haven't done that ever in the past. But when you give reparations to every formerly enslaved person, you say that one group is more important than another, rather than trying to fix societal inequities. We'd rather help more marginalized groups than just one, and we're the side that allows to do that because you don't get all this protesting and civil unrest. Third and final reason we help society is on past thinking. We think not thinking with forward-thinking perspective and going back into the past and trying to right all of your wrongs means you're not going to actually look at the context of where you're in right now, meaning policy gets worse and you're only thinking in the past and not actually addressing the root cause, meaning people don't get the help they need. That being said, let's respond to side government's case. On their first contention about being good for descendants, I just have like a general response. There's no guarantee that people actually use this money for what you say. Sure, they could, but if you get $1,000 a year, you aren't going to be able to get out of where you live. Importantly, because of everything you say, African Americans have been so disadvantaged that even if they get $1,000, you don't have money to live in a $3,000 apartment in New York City because you don't have the job that affords that or the ability to continue making that money and the ability to move out. Importantly, you're probably not going to want to leave your family behind, your community behind. And even if you do get this money, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be able to support you for a long time and it's going to be bad. The second response to their second contention on being good for society, we think it probably just doesn't create a higher middle class. There's probably more inflation. There's more policies not helping for welfare because funding is going to get cut in order to spend for this. We think in general, it doesn't actually make all the changes that you say it will make. Everett will respond more specifically to their case, but because we help the descendants of enslaved people in general, proud to oppose.
Okay.
Hey,
Great.
Emily, give me 1 second. It's like a
Yeah, you're all good. Just let me know when you're ready.
You're good.
Okay. Just getting out my timer. Okay. I will begin my speech. This might be slightly fast, so anyone who wants me to slow down, actually, it probably won't be, whatever. Anyone who wants me to slow down can let me know. Okay, I'll begin my speech of 8 minutes with a 30-second grace. Now, judges, 3 things in the speech. First, 2 key observations and questions I want to ask you. Next, op case. Next, back into gov case. Okay, so the 2 key things we get from op. First thing is like, oh, practicality and feasibility does matter, and we need to look at this. First of all, again, as Xander says at the top of his speech, this motion is a this house supports motion, not a this house would motion. No government is implementing these reparations. This debate is simply about if a rational individual, in theory, agrees with this idea of implementing these reparations for descendants or enslaved people. So insofar as every single one of their contentions rely on this idea that these reparations are going to be very difficult to implement, you really should not buy most of everything that opposition says. But okay, let's assume that they're right. Let's assume that we care about practicality and feasibility. Let's look at the logistics. Why are these reparations actually not that hard to implement? Number one, the government is going to be funding them, and the government can take money out of the military, out of national defense programs, which make up like 30% of government spending, and this amount of spending is simply unnecessary. It will not be that hard for the government to fund. Yes, taxes will be raised slightly, probably for general society, maybe slightly, but this is not a considerable amount that will cause a huge amount of backlash, and we'll get into why general society actually will be happier about this change in a little bit. Third, again, look to the past. Sophie tells you that like, oh, these reparations were different. But again, reparations existed successfully in the past. Why can't this happen in the future, especially since we have all new technology? Fourth point they give you is about this idea that like, oh, all the files were destroyed. Again, we have all this new technology, but like, more so, we think that the government just generally, if someone claimed that they were a descendant of an enslaved person and the file was destroyed, we don't think any government would say, no, you weren't, because that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. They'd probably give them the benefit of the doubt. This is simply not a big deal. Okay, next question that opposition asks you is like, what's the uniqueness of side government? Okay, why is this the only way to truly help these descendants of enslaved people and Black Americans in our society? First of all, as Sandra tells you, this is a unique ability for them to gain social mobility. Black communities in our society have been constantly pushed down in their communities due to lack of resources, redlining, discrimination, all the problems that both sides agree on this. And this solution is unique because it actually does, contrary to what Sophie says, address the root of the problem. Rather than having white people fund new education opportunities, white people funding all this stuff, you're giving money, you're putting money into the hands of these Black Americans. That literally gets to the root. We think this is much better, that they gain the opportunity and the autonomy to help themselves. Second of all, Overton window shift, okay? Sandra really addresses this in our second contention, but I want to say really, really clearly, this is a huge, huge point in this debate. The Overton window shifts on our side. We think that generally people are a moral society, and when you have these reparations implemented, more and more people will be on the side of helping these Black Americans. Yes, there may be some backlash, but we think that generally the society moves towards a less unjust and an anti-discriminatory society. These problems still exist. Both sides agree. At least our society is helping to shift this Overton window uniquely. Since they're arguing for the status quo, they are not arguing for any shift in this window. Okay, let's get into the line by lines. What do we get from their first contention? Okay, we get this idea that like, there's way better ways for the government to reduce inequality. And they talk about like affirmative action. Again, affirmative action doesn't address the root problem. It only exists in college. They don't really fix the problem. So in their first contention, they talk about the benefits to enslaved people, and they talk about the reparations do not work. On their first point, again, these Black Americans are likely to use reparations for good. They want to help their families. They want to help their situations. Most people have families. They're not going to use them to like buy drugs and stuff. This is just simply not beneficial for them. We don't understand why this is that big of a problem, like why we shouldn't trust them to use the money in the way they see fit. Second of all, they say that other people need the money. No, I have a lot to get through. They say that other people need the money. But again, these reparations are uniquely trying to solve a problem. They're uniquely trying to help these descendants of enslaved people, help Black Americans. It's probably a good thing to implement them. Just because other people don't need the money doesn't mean they shouldn't get the money as well. Okay, thirdly, they say that, again, the files have been burned. Again, we say it's not that big of a deal. The US government is probably going to err on the side of equality and equity and give people the benefit of the doubt. Finally, if someone says they're a descendant of an enslaved person, we don't think the government is going to disagree. Okay, these better systems, again, they probably don't work. They're just giving money to the white people and allowing the white people to fix the problem. This is not a good thing. Their second contention on societal attitude, yes, we agree that at least a few people are going to disagree, but we think that, again, these reparations are uniquely addressing the root of the problem. Rather than funding these systems of education, which are completely funded by white people, we are giving money to the source. They say that, like, oh, some people will disagree. Okay, if we stuck with the people who disagreed, where would we be in society? People disagree about all things that are bad. Getting into this a little bit more. Also, their third contention on racism, right? We think that reparations uniquely decrease racism. Look to what Xander tells you in our contention too, this idea of the Overton window shift. People want to be on the side of morality. Our side allows you to do this. OP advocates for other policies to benefit African Americans. So this is non-unique because OP policies also lead to an increase in racism. They're arguing for the status quo. At least we have a pathway to some change. They talk about more hate crimes. No, we think that hate crimes generally go down. I'll get into this a little later in their backlash contention. Also, people are implicitly assuming that, they say that like we're implicitly assuming that these descendants of enslaved people need help, but people implicitly assume that Black Americans need help every day in our society right now, right? Like the difference is now we're allowing these people to help themselves and feel like they have power and autonomy. So just most of their case is not that unique. Okay, on to their backlash contention and their benefits to general backlash contention. We think that like just as an observation, backlash is just simply not that important. I would not vote on backlash in this round. Backlash fades, and also backlash exists for all good things. Look to the feminist movement. When women got the right to vote, there was backlash that existed, but Judge, would you say that the women's right to vote was a necessary thing? Because I would. This backlash is fleeting. The women's right to vote is something that lasts forever and has these lasting important consequences. They say that people are going to be curious about where their money's going. Again, we think that the government would mostly fund it by taking money out of other programs that are just unnecessary. It's not a big deal. And Judge, I ask you this, just because the loudest voices are the ones that are discriminatory doesn't mean they're the majority. We think that most people are going to be in the majority of people who think this is the moral justified thing to do. We should not err on the side of the oppressors. We should be on the side of morality. At least we have some pathway to silencing these discriminatory voices. They say that like, oh, there's this disconnect. No, people know exactly where their money is going. They say that people can't see how their money is helping. Again, this is not a huge impact, and people can see how their money is helping, right? If these individuals are given money, they're given the ability to have upward social mobility, make society better, make society more equitable and equal. They say that it causes protests. This exists on both sides. There's protests. There's going to be also way more protests. If you buy that there's like going to be discrimination and more protests on their side, then you also buy that there's anti-discrimination protests that exist to a larger extent on our side. So we actually help these really good protests happen. It's not symmetrical. They say that inflation and gridlock goes up. Again, by the gridlock is already non-unique. And again, we think that gridlock actually goes down because society is moving in a good direction, right? Silencing these discriminatory majority voices. They say that it's difficult to define. No, it's not really difficult to define, right? Like giving money to these people, it's not a difficult thing. With that, finally, their contentions for our side, again, not that they just say we're not unique. You can cross-apply essentially everything that I said. For their case, we think that it would actually help people get out of their situations because they are literally have this unique opportunity to make money. We're putting money in their hands. That does not create inflation. That actually allows for society to have more money in general, have economic growth without inflation. So with that, I strongly urge a side government ballot. Thank you.
All right. One moment. Okay, I have 8 minutes with a 30-second grace period. 1 second, let me scroll really quick. Okay, is anybody not ready? In that case, I'll begin my speech on my first word. Okay, judges, should the government put more action in to help solve inequalities? Yes, but supporting anti-racism and supporting equity is much different from supporting reparations as the mechanism to get that change. First, let me just extend a couple of things that Sophie gave you about why this won't work at all logistically. One, it's a logistical nightmare. Not everyone who needs these benefits actually get it. The reason for that generally being that like racism and like slavery as like an institution, the entire point of it was to get rid of your identity, to make it so that there is no more record of who you are and that there's no way to be able to actually tell whether or not you were a slave later on in the future. The result of that is if you're trying to pay specifically like people who are the descendants of enslaved people, there is no record for you to look at. There's no technology that's going to like, you know, figure out whether or not you were an enslaved person, because that technology can't exist because it's based on records that we no longer actually have access to. The second one here is backlash and anti-motivation, and that like people just become more racist, saying, you know, why are my tax dollars going towards these other people when I need money myself, right? Like if I'm an impoverished white person, I think to myself, I need this money. Why am I putting my tax dollars away towards these other people? This is really pissing me off. I now hate black people, whatever it might be. And additionally, now people, the people who like, you know, were kind of on the defense before and not just say, oh, the problem is solved. I'm paying my tax dollars. Everything is good now. I don't really need to do anything else more. They tell you that like these people are going to become like these moral actors and are going to be like, ah, yes, you know, we're really helping and like trying to put an effort into solving these things. But I think that what's more likely to happen is people just don't want to do any more work, because the more work that you ask people to do, like people just naturally don't want to spend their money on things. They want to keep it for themselves. And the result of that is there's no reason why all of a sudden by doing these reparations, people are going to be like, ah, yes, I'm so anti-racist now. Okay, let's see what else. The third thing as for why this actually won't work at all is because it's better to actually spend this money on structural change rather than individual change, right? It's better to pay these communities, build schools, help organize these areas, do work to actually undo redlining, rather than just like put a blanket check to a bunch of people and say, okay, work it out yourself, right? There's clearly one way that's actually a lot better organized. It actually undoes inequality in multiple areas across society, not only for enslaved people, but also just general people, like within trying to actually pay this for structural change, rather than just kind of giving people a check and saying that's going to be our way to like, you know, make change in society. Given all of that, I'm now going to go on to their observations and respond to them. Then I'm going to go on to their onto our case and then onto their case. Okay, their first observation was about how practicality doesn't matter. This is a this house supports motion and not a this house would motion. But really what this debate is about like the mechanism by which we solve inequalities, right? Like if this debate was just, should we solve inequalities? Then that's unfairly, yes, obviously we should, right? The question is, should reparations be the thing that we support such that we can then solve these inequalities? We say that the answer is no. Therefore, you do actually need to consider the logistics here in the sense that you need to consider the way in which you're trying to solve these inequalities. Okay, let's move into more of what they said. They talked about how this is an easy logistical problem because like the government funds it. We can take like money out of the military to do all this stuff. First of all, this is not a spending issue. There are literally no records of who were slaves and who weren't. At very least, the records are sparse at best. And also, like Republicans would never want to take money out of the military in the first place. Like this is just going to cause a lot more backlash. Also, there's no federal reparations bills that have ever been passed. Like their examples don't actually work on this federal level. And let's move on to some more things that they said. Okay. They talked about how like it's not a large amount to have backlash. I'd like to say Xander said that this is going to be like tens of thousands of dollars. That's a lot of money. And at very least, like there's a trade-off here, right? Which is that like either you don't give a lot of money and then you don't actually get any of the benefits on their side, or you do give a lot of money and then everyone is really, really pissed off because they don't want to actually like spend all of their tax dollars on this stuff. Given that, there's no way that this actually is going to functionally work because it's just going to lead to more racism, which is going to lead to more of the problems of inequalities in structures generally because people are now against black people and think that they're spending their money wastefully. Okay. They talked about how like, there's like new technology. I already responded to that. Like, can technology read your entire lineage? I don't think so. And then they said like that we have to like give the benefit of the doubt with all these like different issues. We don't. We actually have to consider the logistics here and consider how this is going to function in society. That's actually what the mechanism here and what the debate is about. Okay. Under their second observation, they said like, what is the uniqueness of SideGov? They said that SideGov gives this unique ability for social mobility, right? I think that there are other ways to give people social mobility than just like handing them $10,000, right? Like if like society has been built against you, has been made it such that like, you know, it's really, really difficult for you to get into good schools because they're not in your area and you have to like, you know, take a really long car ride to get to your school every day, right? Like pretty clearly just giving people money doesn't actually solve structural problems. There's no unique reason why this actually increases their social mobility at all. Okay, moving on. They talked about how like you're putting monies into their hands and it's not just like this white person giving them money. I'd like to emphasize like, yes, it shouldn't just be like, you know, this white person doing everything and being like, ah ha ha, I feel so good now because I did something good for you. But it's rather actually working with these communities and helping them rather than just giving them the check and saying, okay, now it's your turn, do it on your own. If you do it bad, then I guess that's your fault, right? Like clearly there's a way to actually solve inequalities, which is you help the people out and you help them by, you know, actually helping them organize rather than just handing them a check and saying, okay, it's your problem now. And lastly, they talk about this window shift very often. They say like, oh yes, people naturally want to be moral. And so uniquely you get a window shift on the side in which people are paying this money, right? And I think that this just actually isn't true. They don't give you any mechanism for why, one, people want to be moral in the first place, two, why people are like against racism in the first place. Like if you look at society today, a lot of people deny that inequality exists in the first place, right? Like people are kind of racist sometimes, especially in America, right? We're kind of known for that, just depressingly. And so the result of that is there's no reason why now them paying their money towards these taxes are all of a sudden going to be like, ah, yes, you know, I realize now that these inequalities are a thing that we need to solve. It's more going to be the chance that like they look at this money and they say, hey, why aren't I getting paid this money? I don't have a lot of money myself. You know, I work on a farm somewhere, right? I need this money instead. This is totally unfair. And then they just get angry at the government. And there's actually a shift in the opposite direction. You can turn this point for our side. If there's a window shift at all, it's going to be a window shift against what they're saying. Okay. Let's move on to their case. Oh, sorry, let's move on to our case first, onto their responses under our first point. Under our first point, they talked about how affirmative action doesn't actually solve the root problem, but yes, it does. Like affirmative action, by definition, is like the idea that you're like helping and you're paying and you're organizing such that you can actually give in like these communities that need help, the help that they need. They don't give any reason why this actually doesn't work. They just like blanketly say that it doesn't work with a lot of warranting here. They talked about how reparations need to help Black Americans and how others should also get this money. And so they kind of like framed this debate as in like, yes, we should support reparations for Black Americans, but we also should support reparations for all these other communities as well, right? But once again, like what you have to consider is the mechanism by which you're doing any of these reparations in the first place, right? Giving a check is not the solution. The way that you, like just giving a check doesn't actually solve anyone's problems. The structures and the problems within those structures still exist. The way that you can actually solve this stuff is by working on the structures rather than just kind of like giving a blanket check and saying that's our solution. They talked about how it's just like giving money to the white people and stuff like that. And just how like in general like we should be caring more about these Black people than other people. I like to say like what about like the Asian communities who had to work on the railroad and were like and had like what do you call it, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and all these problems, right? What about the Native Americans? What about all these other communities, right? At very best, you're going to have it such that like there's two ways to solve this, right? One is you just play Black people and then all these other communities are really mad at you, or two, you play all of these different communities and then the white people say, wait a minute, why aren't I getting this check as well, right? Like the better way to do this is not just give checks to people, but rather to actually work to solve inequality as a problem, right? This money can be much better spent in a lot of different ways rather than just giving this check once again. Okay. They talked about how reparations decreases racism and how people want to be on the side of morality. They don't give any reasoning why people want to be on the side of morality. We give the reasoning why people don't really want to be on the side of morality because they can just kind of tend to be racist. Okay, let's see. They talked about how policies such as affirmative action increase racism as well. But we'd like to say like this is like a uniquely an increase. Like people like hate reparations, right? Like people don't like the idea that like they have to spend their own money towards other people. They kind of like the idea that like it's their own money that they're getting. It's like the way to function this correctly is you have the government give money out from the government towards different communities that need it in general, rather than to like a specific group because of their race or because of their past, right? When you what's it called? When you like single people out simply because of their race, right? Like if I'm like a Black person who wasn't enslaved, right? But I came over from Africa recently and now I'm impoverished or whatever, but I see all my friends who are Black who were enslaved getting all this money, right? Like why aren't I getting that money as well? Pretty clearly, like the line that you're drawing here are completely arbitrary and just lead to people getting really angry. Under our second point, they talked about how like backlash fades and they gave the example of women's rights. We like to say like high taxes is actually very unique here, which is that like look at like the Republican platform's like number one thing about how they lower taxes all the time, right? Like pretty clearly people are going to be really, really angry when the taxes go way up because people have to actually pay this stuff, or you take it out of the military and then Republicans get mad because they want the money to be in the military in the first place. Flow everything that Sophie says through about how this is actually going to lead towards a lot of mechanisms against anti-racism in the first place and how like all these Republicans are then going to have all these things that get stuck in Congress. What else did they say? They talked about how people can see how this money is helping, but like racist people just kind of like tune these inspiring stories out, and actually like people just ignore this in the first place because of their predispositions against this race. For all these reasons, I strongly urge an opposition ballot.
All right. Let's do this. Is everyone ready? All right. Starting my time now. I want to do 3 things in this speech. First, I want to characterize this round for you, make it super clear what the 2 worlds are and what you're voting off of. Second, I want to go through Gov's claims and why they don't win. Third, and finally, I want to tell you why Op does. Before I do that, though, let's characterize this round by asking 2 characterizing questions. The first question I want to ask is, being a descendant of an enslaved person the most sure way to determine whether you need help or not? On-side opposition, we say it's undoubtedly not. Like, you could be wealthy and rich, you also could not be, and that's totally true. But either way, it's definitely not the sure way to do it. It takes into account 0 context, 0 data, 0 information, and probably is exclusive, and you probably can't even prove for a fact that you're a descendant of an enslaved person, and probably everyone who needs the help can't get it in the first place. We'd say it's not the cleanest way to figure this out. The second clarifying question I want to ask is, are there better ways to determine if someone needs this help? Because we just observed it's not the best way. What are the better ways we can have? We say there are tons of better ways. Everett tells you, look to the modern context. That has a higher probability of creating good because it takes into account more factors. It looks at more people. It looks at all of the people who are being marginalized, not just the specific group of people. Beyond that, we look at things that exist in the status quo when we try to solve inequity by looking at actual data and problems. We say that works more effectively since it takes in a higher probability. It has a higher probability of working because it takes into more factors, more context, more data. That probably works better. Why does this matter? We say if there are better ways to determine factors and help more people, then we should do that. And we should not do the thing that will not help and could potentially stop us from getting future progress because people are now really upset and won't pass any more positive policy. That being said, let's get into what I think Xander will tell you in his next speech and why it doesn't win them the round. The first thing that I think Xander will say is he'll say that overall, you probably get more help for people, descendants of enslaved people, if you give reparations and they get out of poverty. But Everett tells you three brilliant things that take it that this argument, even if it's true, it's not enough for them to win the round. First, Everett tells you that there literally exist structures that push people down. They will still push people down if you give them money. Redlining will still push people down. All of these structures that you complain about still push people down. That doesn't go away. Secondly, Everett tells you it is literally impossible to get out of poverty with a $10,000 lump sum because those dollars aren't going to afford you a new apartment if you don't have the education to be at the financial level where you can afford a $3,000 a rent apartment. That doesn't fix anything. You don't solve anything. It's just a band-aid solution. Third and finally, Everett tells you that even if this completely helps you, the new existing racism that exists in society because they're mad about this policy pushes you right back down. So you figured out how to get out of racism and then you got pushed right back down. We think this policy does not work. The second thing I think Xander will try to tell you is this thing about shifting the Overton window. But again, Everett tells you three brilliant things. First, Everett says, never, ever have people been happy to pay more taxes. They will continue to not be happy to pay more taxes because no one wants to spend more money. It's logically incorrect. It just doesn't make sense. The second thing that Everett says is people start by being racist. They won't suddenly be unracist. The only thing that's going to happen is they will be more racist because their money is coming out of their pockets, meaning they are more upset. Third and finally, Everett says, people want help too. The white person who's not making money, even though they're in poverty, is going to be upset. They in-group, they don't help each other. They don't want more help for Black people who need it just as much. That being said, here are two places you're going to vote op, even though you're not voting Gov. First is on the anti-motivation to keep making change. A few reasons this matters. We tell you there's backlash. Republicans will never again pass any more spending bills. People in the streets will no longer support all of these movements. Other groups who won't get help will be unhappy. Why does this matter? Because even in the short term, if everything Psy government says is correct and they get the benefits of getting people out of poverty, when you don't actually get the institutional change, you don't get more education systems, you don't get more benefits, you don't get more quality of life improvements, you don't get more welfare, you don't get more help, that's a longer term impact that affects more people that causes you to not have any benefits. We are the side that allows you to get more benefits. We're always going to outweigh on time frame for a long-term benefit rather than the short-term benefit of getting out of poverty briefly and also the amount of people we get out of poverty. Second place you're voting Gov is on the more likelihood of getting change. In the status quo, we are slowly becoming better. We are slowly getting more policies. We are decreasing redlining. We are getting that. If you do not stop that change by implementing a policy, there is zero probability that stops. We don't get it to stop. They have a chance of making it stop. We'd rather it not stop. We are proud to oppose.
Okay, great speech. 5 minutes, 30-second grace period. Just going over some observations that was brought up in the block before finally going over 3 voting issues in the big round. Is anybody not ready? Great. My time begins in 3, 2, 1. The fundamental question that you have to ask yourself before you cast your ballot in this debate round is, why would you vote in an op world when there is literally no ground? The only idea that we get is the reason why you should vote op is on structural change. However, what we see is that they do not support any variation of structural change except for affirmative action. So the next thing I ask you is, how has affirmative action worked out? Well, we still see that the pay gap among Black and white families is extremely bad. We still see that the oppressors are white people in the status quo, and we still see that there is structural racism within the status quo. When you vote for opposition, you are voting for the status quo. And since both sides tell you that the status quo is not preferable, by that there is literally no solution by voting opposition. That being said, we have to buy one thing, which is when you vote for a side with reparations, it might not be the most efficient way to solve racism, but it definitely does more than whatever the world we live in today is doing. That being said, let's get into the observation. Judge, it really doesn't matter if reparations are the best way to solve for the inequalities former enslaved people face, because this round is about whether a world with reparations is better than a world we currently live in, which is what OP supports. We say yes resoundingly, because at the very least the pay gap gets cut. They argue that there are better structural policies, but that does not matter because OP doesn't do structural policies. OP doesn't do anything outside of what we currently live in the status quo. Therefore, by that, when you vote for an opposition ballot, you are doing nothing. You revert to the racist world that we currently live in, where systematic racism is rampant. That being said, support an ideology that gives back money which was put into the economy for 3 reasons. The first is feasibility. We tell you that this is actually a feasible option at the net. Why do we say this? We say it's easy to do. Even if we don't get every single formerly enslaved descendant, we are still causing a change in the actual structure of America. Even then, we tell you it likely doesn't matter. Emily tells tells you that we have the technology to do so, by that they don't counter this whatsoever. So you're going to be buying that we can get to the people. The second point here is backlash, and this is arguably OP's greatest impact in this debate round. Here's why it really does not matter. They say that policy will never get passed ever again once reparations happen, but we tell you this really is not the case. If you buy this type of logic, then why, once we gave women the right to vote or black people the right to vote, did we never see government policy get passed again? Because it just doesn't work that way. Backlash is not this overwhelming force that kills all policy in the future. By the whenever big change happens, it's not followed with backlash, or backlash that stops progress for the next thousands of years. Yeah.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I do think this is new analysis. We talk about how no policy is going to be passed by Republican lawmakers in my first speech, and then Emily responds to it by saying that backlash comes with anything good and backlash fades, but we don't ever get this response.
So this is a response to, this is an extension of Emily's point, which is when something big happens, backlash doesn't kill policy for like ever. It fades out, which is
okay. A judge's discretion.
Okay, time continues in 3, 2, 1. At the end of the day, you're not voting on feasibility because Emily tells you that it's never going to actually happen, that we're not able to find these people. That makes no sense. The government knows its citizens, and there is progress and processes in order for this to happen. This is also a this House supports motion, as we tell you from the very top of the case. So it doesn't matter about feasibility because it's about the actual theory of it's about the theory of reparations, not actually the practicality of it. Second, on backlash, we tell you to look to what Emily told you, which is this idea that backlash always fades. Therefore, you never vote on backlash because you should not vote with the oppressors, which is exactly what opposition side supports when they say that we should not do anything radical for fear of backlash. The third point here is the opposition world. Judge, if you take away anything, take away the fact that opposition supports a status quo, one that is filled with rampant systemic racism, and one that is filled with no outlook for Black people due to the fact that there is a racial pay gap. You only vote for affirmative in this debate round because we tell you that there are systems in place through paying these African Americans that allows for them to be able to lift themselves out of their communities and restore their progress. When you think about how to sign your ballot, think about what you see in an opposition world, and then you will realize that it is exactly the same to the world we live in. Affirmative action solves nothing because it is promoted it's promoted by the white oppressors, which is why you can never vote for an opposition ballot, because they literally support the same structures of oppressors that we have in the status quo. The military point is literally never rebutted by that we get the money anyway. White people are not going to forever hate Black people as a result of reparations, because white people aren't going to have to pay more taxes since this is coming out of the military. Emily tells you this in her second speech. So by their backlash point has minimal scope at best, since white people are never going to hate Black people since they have to pay more taxes in order for reparations to occur. The government is taking money out of the military, so it never happens. Let's take a step back, Judge. At the end of the day, you vote affirmative on autonomy. We give Black people the autonomy to actually be able to lift themselves out of their communities and cause actual cultural restoration. You are not going to be voting for opposition because they support a status quo which is filled with rampant racism. They don't change anything. They support the affirmative action which has led to the same pay gap, the same educational disparities that we have in the status quo. When evaluating your ballot, evaluate who supports those who are in poverty the most. They support those who are already in poverty, but we are actually causing change for this reason.
Sorry, one more time. Yeah. You feel bad I did this twice. I think the argument that taxes won't go up is also new. In Emily's speech, she says that sure, taxes will go up a little bit. That happens. Everett responds to it, and the argument that taxes won't go up at all is new.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, sure. Taxes go up a little bit, but the military is paying for it. Okay, I have 8 seconds. Time continues in 3, 2, 1. Even if taxes go up a little bit, by the fact that at that point you still don't see the backlash that side government wants you to believe. Therefore, you're not seeing the greatest impact of backlash. For these reasons, you have to vote government. Thank you. Great round, guys.
Great round.
Good debating.
Good job, everyone.
Wait, okay. So I just want to say, first of all, overall, the debate was very, very well reasoned, very persuasive. Both sides were very persuasive. In the very end, the judges voted for the opposition. And I'm going to ask if any of the other judges want to give their feedback first.
I can go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I never done any debate when I was young. So I'm a lawyer by trade. So the the technical part I probably a novice to it. But just overall both sides very convincing and shows very high level preparation. I just I voted for opposition because their argument's a little more convincing for me at least. And there was some inconsistent by the government in their arguments. And I wrote it down a few things. Sorry, I'm going through my notes here. Like one point, the government said I guess U.S. government don't mind to give money reparation to people even that they don't have the file to back up, because if government deny that would cause a lawsuit. But later in the rebuttal, then they said there's feasibility, there's technology to do it. So it's kind of a little inherent inconsistency there. So I don't know what position that is. So that's one of the reasons I find that a little inconsistent. So I just kind of want to point out, like, to watch out for something like that. Let's see. And like statements like affirmative action supported by the white oppressors. That's nice, like almost like a political soundbite, but in reality, if you kind of like back that up, I think it's kind of like it just sounds like kind of like a Republican soundbite. It doesn't sound like it's real, proven fact. So stuff like soundbite might sound like quick to say it, but if you really look at it, some of these things fall apart. So just kind of my observations, things like that. Just to sort of like question your own statements and beliefs. Sometimes, like you guys really young, you hear a lot of more of these than when we're growing up, the sound bites, and you want to question whether they're actually telling the truth or just like trying to politically persuade people. That's all. Just my observation in general. But really, really difficult debate, and you guys did phenomenal. I mean, it's the best team I've ever heard, because the amount of information and just thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. I guess I can go next. So this was an excellent debate. Good job, everyone. I did vote opposition. It did end up coming down to sort of what the meaning of the debate was. I think Op did a really good job in pointing out that it's about really the core of the debate is not just whether or not we should solve for racism and inequality, because I think most of us can agree, yes, we should, but really why reparations is the key. And I don't think that AF was able to fully prove the uniqueness and solvency and why that would solve all of the issues that were raised. And then also the feasibility argument. I do think that feasibility would play into whether or not the United States federal government would end up going through with something like this and would support this. And I think Op was able to really effectively prove that. But I mean, overall, I think the speeches were really well done. I think it was really organized. Thank you everyone for signposting. Yeah, I did just want to say it was an overall phenomenal job. So yeah.
Okay, so I'll just wrap it up. Generally, yeah, I voted for Op as well. I think generally all of the points everyone else said, I mostly agree with. On the logistics, I struggled a lot with this because at the beginning, government pointed out that this was a case on this house supports and not so much whether or not this house should or would. But I ended up deciding that, like, well, it seemed to come down to whether or not reparations would actually do very much. And there was a lot of back and forth, and in the end, it felt like passing the policy would not have done very much. And so I voted for Op.
Great round, guys.
Great job, guys. Good luck.
Good luck.
Xander,